Welcome, everyone. I am Joy Bauman, and I am a program specialist with the CFAES Center for Cooperatives at Ohio State University. And our mission at the Center for Cooperatives is to comprehensively integrate the teaching, the research, and the extension programs of the college. And we hope to create and extend knowledge to emerging and existing cooperatives in Ohio and West Virginia and beyond. So today, our guest for our Appalachia Cooperates seminar is Mike Palmieri. Did I say that right, Mike?
Yeah, you got it. It's close.
Who is from the Ohio Employee Ownership Center at Kent State University. And he'll be speaking today. But before we get started with the program, here are just a few housekeeping items. Participants can ask questions throughout the session using the Q&A function found down on the toolbar for Zoom. And you can ask questions anonymously using the Q&A function. This session is being recorded and made available online following the session, and we will send an email to everyone who is registered when the recording is available. Please give us a little bit of time to edit the video and make it available to everyone. If there are any resources that are shared throughout today's presentation, we'll share links following the session as well when we send that email out to each of you. So at the end of today's session, we'll share an evaluation, and your feedback helps us to improve our future learning opportunities, and we really would appreciate your responses if you'll do that at the end of the session. So with that, we'll let Mike take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Joy. I really appreciate it. And before we start off, thanks again to OSU for inviting me to be able to speak today. It's very exciting, and thank you for everyone who took the time out to attend this. I know it's a busy time of the year, so let's hop right into it. So I'm Mike Palmieri. Like Joy said, I'm with the Ohio Employee Ownership Center, and today we're going to be talking about how employee ownership can be used as a strategy to retain jobs and create wealth. Throughout the presentation, I'll be using the term employee ownership and worker ownership. I mean exactly the same thing. It's just you'll hear those two terms back and forth, and I'm referring to the same idea. So a little overview of how I kind of set up this presentation. I'm going to give you a little bit about the OEOC, the Ohio Employee Ownership Center, as well as OWN, which is the Ohio Worker Ownership Network, of which the CFAES Center at OSU is a member of. And then we'll hop into some of our economic challenges that we're facing and finish off with how employee ownership can be used as a strategy to tackle those three different distinct challenges. So a little bit about the OEOC. We were founded in 1987 and we're housed within Kent State University. The three kind of main buckets of what we do is research and advocacy around employee ownership. We also provide outreach and technical assistance. So we reach out to business owners who are looking for a succession planning strategy and talk to them about the option of employee ownership. And we also do education and training. So for existing employee-owned companies, we provide a year-long kind of program of training and education opportunities. And we have a network of about 80 employee-owned companies in Ohio, but also some companies out of state. And we also provide maintain a network of 100 plus professional service providers. So if we find a company needs some sophisticated services that are beyond our means, an attorney, maybe an investment banker, we have a referral network that we bring to bear. And so that's generally what we do. I won't spend too much more time on that. Now, the important part, I think, for even more so for this presentation, is the OWN network, right? The Ohio Worker Ownership Network. And what happened was in 2020, we formed a network of 10 nonprofits from across Ohio who are committed to the development of cooperatives and worker-owned enterprises more specifically. And so you can see here, we have representation within every region of Ohio, as well as every major metropolitan area. So these are all nonprofits that are working on economic development, mainly through the startup phase for businesses, or even that transition phase where a business owner may be considering selling the company to their employees. And so the idea of creating this network was to be able to really create an infrastructure across the state to share resources and to really kind of combine the shared knowledge that we all have. So within our network, there's decades upon decades of experience for both business startups and employee-owned transitions. One of the first tasks that we had coming together as a network was to really release a report that made the case for employee ownership and talked about what we as a network plan to do. And so much of this presentation today is going to be a snapshot of that report. At the end of the presentation, I could provide a link that gives you the overview of the network and also where you could access the full report itself. But today's presentation is kind of a high-level overview of those things. So let's move to those 3 economic challenges that we outlined in the report. And the first one is one that maybe some of the attendees may already be familiar with, which is that half of all business owners, small business owners, are in the baby boomer generation. And quite a few of them are set to retire in the next decade or so. In Ohio, it's about 54% of private businesses are owned by baby boomers, and they represent quite a large chunk of all the firms in Ohio. So according to our research, it's around 94,000 firms employing over 2 million people and doing hundreds of billions of dollars in both payroll and sales. So no small chunk of the business landscape are we talking about here. And one of the big issues is that although many of these business owners, about half, are likely to exit their business in the next decade, around 60 to 80%, depending on what survey you look at, finds that they don't have a formal succession plan for the business. What will happen when they exit? And so that's not a great figure, especially if you don't have that plan, right? You will exit in some way, but not having that succession plan put in place when that event occurs, it's much less likely that you'll be able to really have the business change hands in the way you want. As a business owner, being able to access some of the wealth from that business, it's just very uncommon. And a couple other trends that I think are important to point out is that family-owned businesses, the rate of succession to another family member is declining over time. So only about 1/3 of all family-owned businesses now transfer to the next generation. And likewise, only about 1 in 5 businesses that are put on the market sell. And so what we see employee ownership as providing, it doesn't work for every single company, and I'll be open and honest, but for a lot of good companies, right, they're profitable, they're doing well, it's certainly an option that should be explored, and in many cases is one that's just not known by the business owner themselves, which can kind of get us out of this predicament of having a really good business go under, or maybe being sold to an outside buyer who might just scrap it or use it for a customer list or the like. So that's kind of one of the main things that we think is really important to keep an eye on.
Mike, we have a question in the Q&A box. Someone wants to know, what is the data source on slide 6?
Yes, so this data source here is from the census. So it used to be every 7 years, so years that end in 5 and 2. They would do a survey of small business owners. And in that survey, they provide you the different demographics, including age. And so this is for all companies that have 5 or more employees that are owned by business owners that are 55 years or older. So it's aggregate data, so there is definitely room for error. It's not that they surveyed every single business owner in Ohio, but they're able to, through a sample, kind of provide estimates, and that's what's going on here. I could provide the link to it later on if that's what's wanted, but I believe it's called the Survey of Small Business Owners, and it's done through the census.gov, I believe, has access to the files.
And we had one other quick question as well. Someone wants to know if you provide succession planning services for other Appalachian states, or is your service area limited to Ohio?
So we'll do initial consultations, and I'm speaking for the Ohio Employee Ownership Center, not all our network members. So we'll do initial consultations for almost anyone. At some point, if we feel it necessary, we will then direct you to a service provider, whether that be, like I said, an investment banker or an attorney who's in your area, if that's what you're looking to work with. We also have a stable of service providers that we have. But in terms of that initial consultation, we really don't have a geographic boundary. So if you have questions, feel free to reach out, and we're happy to walk through those early stages and then find out what works best for you. If it's someone you want to use local, then we're happy to, kind of do the digging and find out who's the local person in your area. But we've worked with many companies outside of Ohio. And especially in these times, we've gotten better at doing remote assistance, right? So does that get all the questions, Joy?
Yeah, that's all we have so far.
Okay, cool. So then moving on to that second kind of broad basket of challenges is the development of low wage kind of workforce and employment instability, or some people will use the word precarity, right? And so what we're looking at here is the Brookings Institute did a report, I think back in 2019, that found around 45% of all workers ages 18 to 64 could be classified as low wage, earning a median annual income of around $18,000. And a lot of the growth in different industries, the industries that are seeing the most growth are most likely going to also be within the low wage sector. Now, we have seen some increase in wages, certainly, and this graph is a bit dated, right? So it ends in 2019, prior to COVID. And so there has been an increase in wages for sure. But I think that this graph is telling in the sense that real wages have been largely stagnant for the last 40 years. And even with some of the wage growth that we're seeing under COVID, with inflation being at the rate it is, the real wage, although it bumped up a little bit, isn't that much higher in terms of purchasing power. And so that's a real problem too for employees of all kinds, is being able to make enough money to not just get by, but to actually provide a cushion, right? And I think that that's kind of summed up in a stat that it gets thrown around a lot, but I think it's really telling. A survey by the Federal Reserve a while back found that 40% of workers couldn't cover a $400 expense. Other studies have showed that the median retirement savings for employees without pensions in the US is a median of 0. So it just goes to show that there's a lot more to employment than just the wages you're providing, but also the possibility to build wealth. And that could be through income and savings. But I think what also is really important aspect is it's through benefits. There was a great study that came out from the, I believe it was, I forget which. Oh yes, it was a study for looking at what the total compensation of employees was and how much of that total compensation was made up of both wages and benefits. And what they found was 1/3 of total compensation came from benefits. And I think that that's really important to keep in mind, that a good job isn't just high paying, but it's providing workers protection so that when some kind of health emergency occurs, it doesn't immediately put that worker into debt. In the workplace, because the US being how it is really one of the main ways that you can get those benefits. And so employment is more than just high wages, but also the benefits they provide. And the reason that I want to bring up this study that looked at how important benefits were was they found that the benefits you receive from your workplace can really help explain a lot of the wealth and income inequality. It just so happens that 10 of the 13 occupations with the most future growth are in low wage. So in healthcare, in some lower skilled construction, as well as in other service areas. And those same industries are also the least likely to provide great benefits. And it's really important for looking at the importance of employee ownership that we really focus on the whole picture, right? So it's not just higher wages, but whether or not individuals are receiving stable employment, that they can know their schedule beforehand, and that they have a cushion for when certain unplanned events occur. And then the third and final challenge that we think is really important to keep an eye on is rising income and wealth inequality. And again, this goes back to the conversation we had about it being more than just income. This chart, however, it's focusing just on income, and it shows that the share of total income paid in a given year, broken down by the bottom 50% of earners and the top 1% of earners, that since 1980, the share that's being captured by the top 1% of earners has doubled, while the share going to the bottom 50% of earners has halved. And I think that it's just a really striking graph that shows you the extent of income inequality here in the US. But we should also keep in mind there's a difference between income inequality and wealth inequality. So if income are the wages or the dividends that you're receiving, there's also wealth, right? The assets that you hold, your savings accounts, your stocks, retirement plans, homes, cars, right? Things of that nature. And in that case, it's actually there's even larger inequalities when you look at wealth itself. And likewise, if you dig a little bit deeper and start comparing across gender or across race, those inequalities open up even more here in the US. Now, one of the really important pieces I always like to point out is that income and wealth are very much connected to one another, right? The more income you make, the more likely you are to be able to save, which in turn can generate wealth. And I think we all understand that. But an important point to make as well is that wealth can drive income inequality. And that's because a lot of assets that would be called wealth generate income, right? Whether they be stocks, getting dividends, or whether it be interest on some kind of savings account. And so as you have larger wealth, it actually feeds in to further income inequality. And that's important, and we'll get into it later about the impact that employee ownership can make when it provides employees a capital stake in the companies which they work. So we have those three kind of larger trends that we think are really important to keep an eye on. And what we really feel is necessary is to have a policy solution that takes into account all three of these different challenges. So often there's lots of ways to remedy all three of these. The problem is usually that those policies focus in on one of those problems and go to fix it. And the other issue is that, there's not a lot of integration with the policies that are out there that can both reduce economic inequality, provide good paying jobs, and also retain and grow businesses in a given community. And then I think attached to that, the other issue is there may be policies that can help solve this, but they tend to not get a lot of political support across the spectrum. So raising the minimum wage is certainly something that would be great. It would really help with the income side of it, but how much would it help us in retaining and growing businesses? A lot of times the policies will focus either on employees or business owners, on income or wealth, but don't really bring them all together. And that's why we're really excited about employee ownership and expanding it, is that it really does allow you to address all three of these issues and has some pretty wide spread political support. So this is just one example of the many surveys that are out there. There's it's called the General Social Survey. It's done every year. It's a representative sample of the US population. And there was one question that asked whether or not you prefer to work at an employee-owned company, a private or investor-owned company, or a public government entity. And you can see there's overwhelming support for individuals kind of recognizing that working at an employee-owned company is pretty great. And it's tough to find anything, right, that gets you 2/3 majorities in all political classes, right, conservative, liberal, and moderate. So I always like to point that out, that employee ownership is a win-win-win, not only in the economic sense or for business owners or for workers, but also politically. It's very appealing to individuals on all sides of the aisle. So what is employee ownership, right? When we refer to employee ownership, we're talking about companies where employee owners at minimum own a financial stake in their company. And I say at minimum because the employee ownership world is diverse. It comes in different forms, But I'd also point out that the world of employee ownership, it occurs in all sized companies and all types of industries. So it's a kind of model that works really with any kind of company. Today, the 10% of the private sector workforce in the US works for an employee-owned company. And the way I derive that is there's about 14 million employee owners working at 7,000 employee-owned businesses here in the US. And if you take the size of the private sector workforce, that gets you to around 10%. So although it's not that well known, it's by no means a marginal part of our economy. It's here. And in Ohio, we actually have one of the more vibrant employee ownership sectors in the country. So we have about 20 worker cooperatives and 300 employee stock ownership plans, which are sometimes referred to as ESOPs. And I think it's important just to point out the three general models of employee ownership that are out there. So there's the employee stock ownership plans that I mentioned above. And these are qualified retirement plan trusts that invest primarily in the stock of that sponsoring company. Participants are paid out the financial value of the stock that's put into their accounts when they retire, or otherwise when they leave the company. And so an ESOP's interesting in that it's a retirement plan, right? And it can own anywhere between 1 and 100% of the stock of a given company. So there's flexibility on whether or not the company is 100% or as little as 1%. Then there's the worker cooperative. This is a less common form of employee ownership than ESOPs. There's around 500 worker co-ops in the US. There's around 6,500 ESOPs, just to give you perspective. And a worker cooperative is not a retirement plan. It's a form of corporate entity in which it's 100% owned and operated by its employee members. And governance of that cooperative corporation is based on one member, one vote, and profits are distributed based on the amount of work hours provided to the company. So very similar, if you're familiar with how cooperatives work, you can imagine it's a patronage at the end of the year based on hours worked rather than the amount of services used, right? Because in a worker cooperative, the service is labor. And then finally, there's a third model it's still very few in the US, but it's growing in popularity, which is the employee-owned trust. It's the main model of employee ownership in the UK, and it's growing support here in the US. And what that is a perpetual trust that owns the stock of a company. It's governed by a trustee or a set of trustees. Employees do not own the company shares directly. Instead, the way that employees participate in the success of the company is something very similar to a profit sharing plan that will distribute a portion of company earnings at the end of the year. So these three forms will get you pretty far in understanding the different models of employee ownership that are out there. The benefits of employee ownership is, like I mentioned before, for those business owners who aren't able to see a pathway forward for succession, it helps create a willing buyer for the business, and it allows them to ensure that their legacy is continued. And I think that that's so important. There's a lot of business owners out there who want to make sure that their company isn't just kind of sold for parts or a customer list, right? They want to ensure that legacy. Workers benefit through higher wages, better benefits, and more stable employment. The companies also benefit. There's a whole bunch of research that shows employee ownership is associated with increased company performance. And then finally, and I think this is really important to stress, is that communities benefit from employee-owned companies, because employee-owned companies, research has shown, are less likely to leave a given community, to close down or relocate. And this helps create a kind of community stability when it comes to the business landscape and really just employment in general in a given community. So I'm just going to run through a little bit more details for the first three of these. And that has to do with the selling owner. So what we're looking at here are a few examples of owners who've sold their company. And the top is the Moats Group. It's a pretty large company based out of Southwest Ohio. They do turf fields, and they have some large contracts as well. I believe they did the Cincinnati Bengals field. And the owner here decided to sell 30% of the companies to employees. And what's great about this is that selling owners are able to get a fair market value for the business when they sell to any form of employee ownership, which allows them to get a bit of liquidity, right, for the business that they helped build. It also, as I mentioned before, helps ensure the legacy of that business and kind of create some continuity there for employees. In addition to that continuity, employee ownership models allow the selling owner to stay on with the business, perhaps not as an owner now, but as someone who might get that management team prepared. They can stick around for a few years. They don't have to, but it does provide you that flexibility if that's what you're looking for as a business owner. And then finally, there's some really great tax benefits for owners who sell 30% or more of the company when it comes to capital gains. And in the case of ESOPs, there's also some tax benefits for the company itself. The other two images that I didn't notice here at the bottom left is Berry Insulation. That's an HVAC company that converted to a worker cooperative. And to the right on the bottom is Patty Cake Bakery, which is a vegan bakery shop in Columbus, Ohio. And I picked these just to kind of show that this employee ownership is in every kind of industry sector and sized company, right? It depends on where you're at. That's what we at the OEOC do, and own members as well, is to walk you through and figure out what is the model that would work best for you. So for employee owners, I mentioned all those benefits that they have. I think some of the top line important pieces are, like I said, there's tons of research. So they range in how much higher, but anywhere between 8 and 33% higher wages employee owners receive compared to workers at conventionally owned companies. They're far less likely to be laid off compared to workers at conventional firms as well. That's what this chart is showing us here, is just for every one layoff, which is in blue for employee owners, there could be 7.3 to 6.2 times the amount of layoffs at other typical non-employee owned companies. And you can see this pattern. It may increase over time, but it's always much, much lower, the amount of layoffs.
I have a question for you, Mike.
Yes.
The question is, what is the primary way that employees generate the capital to purchase the business?
Yeah, so one of the things is that I think is really important to stress is that often these are financed deals. So there is a loan that's taken out to pay the seller or the selling owner. And over time, the company is who is paying off that loan. So it's very rare these days for employees to be putting their own money into the purchasing of this company. It's often a finance deal, and the company is who's paying off that loan over time, without getting too much into the weeds. And whoever asked that, let me know if that's enough or. Yeah, so that's generally how many of these deals are. There's also cases where the selling owner may even hold the note, right? Depending on what their goals and objectives are, how soon they want to be paid off. So that's happened as well. But usually there's a loan from a bank that's enabling the sale of the company to employees.
I think that answered it. Thanks.
Okay, great. And so we talked a lot before about the importance of providing benefits, both from a stability standpoint for employees, but also from a wealth generating standpoint, right? It smooths out all the potholes in the road of life when you have good benefits. And so this is a great study that was done by the National Center for Employee Ownership that looked at employee owners ages 28 to 34. And they were able to compare employee owners and non-employee owners across a number of different workplace benefits. And we're looking at that chart right here. And as you can see, they're much more likely to receive dental insurance, to have flexible work schedules, tuition reimbursement, childcare subsidies. I mean, the entire gamut of benefits employee-owned companies deliver. And I think that's because these companies are different, right? In a number of ways, not just their structure, but the way that they view employees and the labor that they provide. And then also, in addition to these benefits, right, there's also the employee ownership benefit, that it provides a financial stake in the business to employee owners. And this gets back to that question of economic inequality, both wealth and income. Is a lot of that inequality is driven by the ownership of assets or lack thereof amongst everyday non-managerial employees. And so there was a great study that was put out by Rutgers, the Institute for Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing, that did a first of its kind, largest quantitative and qualitative survey of hundreds of employee owners that were mid to low income. And so the reason they did that was to really show that this wealth building opportunity isn't because it's only being offered in white collar positions, right? But that you could even see it happening with low to moderate income employee owners. And I think this chart is really telling. I mean, what it's showing is the ESOP account value, so that's that retirement plan that holds the company shares, as well as the 401k account value of employee owners at a set of employee-owned companies. And that is in the red and blue for the employee owners. And then that's being compared to the national average for that same group of non-employee owners. And as you can see in the case of Black, Latino, Latina, and white employee owners, they have far more wealth than the average individual in that same demographic group. One important note that I'll point out, especially in ESOPs, is that the ESOP account is 100% employee contributions. So employee owners are not contributing their own wages to purchase stock in the company. This is a benefit that is given to them through employee ownership or through their employment at this company, right? So those ESOP account values build over time and do not come out of the wages, again, adding more stability to the lives of employee owners. And then finally, for company performance, there's tons and tons of research out there, but high level is they're less likely to go out of business for any reason. There was a great study that tracked employee-owned companies from 1991 to 2011. So it included a few of the recessions. And they found that even through recessions, they were much less likely to close, to go bankrupt, or default on loans. And they also have much higher sales, employment, and productivity growth compared to non-employee-owned companies. However, caveat, right, and this is what this graphic is getting to, is it's not just providing the financial incentive that gets employee-owned companies to these big performance metrics. These outcomes are only achieved when employee-owned companies create an ownership culture, which has the financial incentive, which is what we talked about, right? That ownership piece for employees. People care about things that they own. But that's not enough. There also has to be engagement and input opportunities for employees at employee-owned companies. And there needs to be a good deal of education and training, which allows employee owners to contribute not just some knowledge, right, but to really understand the business. And once they understand the business through education and training, the input they provide is much better. They're more likely to provide it knowing that when the company does better, they do better. And you start getting this virtuous circle, as some of us call it, or ownership culture, as it's referred to as well. So getting back to that own network that I reviewed in the beginning, those 10 nonprofits, how do we help, right? So let's say you're interested in employee ownership, bringing it to your community. How do members of the OWN network help? We help raise awareness, really important. I think that one of the major gaps is that a lot of business owners and economic development practitioners just don't know what employee ownership is, maybe only at a surface level, but how to put that into your given community to help unlock a lot of the benefits is a big wall. Also, the technical assistance side. So if a business owner kind of understands it a little bit, the surface level, wants to move along, it's really important to get timely and reliable information around employee ownership. All the members of the OWN network do that. Access to capital. I know a question came up earlier about it. For larger companies, access to capital through a typical bank is not that hard to get. But for some companies, especially with 20 or less employees, this may be an issue. And so some of the members of the OWN network have their own loan funds, which can help finance some of these sales to employees. We also have connections with a bunch of individuals in investment banking that we could also help, right? So it's both the network we have as well as internal loan funds that our members at OWN have as well. And then finally, the ongoing education piece that I was mentioning in the last slide. It really helps companies reach their true potential when they educate and train those employee owners to really be able to think and act like owners in the company. And again, OWN members have really great training and education programs that run year round. So we provide that as well.
I have another question in the Q&A box.
Yeah.
And the question is, does the ESOP model lead to lack of retirement portfolio diversification, thus making the employee more vulnerable to economic loss in the end?
Yes, that's a great question. And there's been a lot written about that. So two things that I like to point out. The first one was the point I made prior, which was that none of the money within the ESOP is the individual's own money from wages. It's company contributions. But also, because the ESOP is a regulated retirement plan, there are diversification regulations put in place. So when an employee owner reaches a certain age, they can begin to diversify the ESOP account over time. The second thing I like to point out is that employee-owned companies are more likely to provide a 401k plan on top of the ESOP plan than a typical company is to provide one plan. So let me repeat that again. An ESOP is more likely to provide both the ESOP and a 401k, diversified 401k, than a typical company is to provide any retirement benefit whatsoever. So there is, of course, there's always risk, right? If the company ends up failing or something bad happens to that ESOP company, the value of the ESOP account will drop. But overall, ESOP companies tend to perform much better. And looking at it from a total kind of compensation or total retirement portfolio, treat their employees much better and also provide that 401k benefit on top of the ESOP account.
Great, thanks.
That's a great question because absolutely, right? With ownership comes risk and there's no way to get around that, but there are some guardrails that have been put up. That's a great question. So I'm ending getting to the end of the presentation because I want to take some questions. But if you're kind of listening to this and you have some interest and you're thinking, okay, what can we do next? There's like three main pieces. One is to partner with an OWN member who are up here. You can see all the different ones and reach out. You know, we've done a lot of outreach to business owners. We know outreach strategies. We're happy to work with you to kind of dig into what your community may need or may want. We have the resources, we want to share them. So please reach out. Another step is to contact elected officials, public administrators, or economic development organizations. Like I said earlier, a lot of times these ideas click, right? A lot of economic development officials want to retain businesses, want to provide good jobs. They just may not know about how employee ownership is really well positioned to do that. So again, we're happy to help with that education if you plan to make that outreach. And then finally, just kind of engaging and assessing the needs of your local business community. Succession planning, it's not sexy, right? It sounds a little bit boring, but if you think about all the companies who are nearing the succession planning event in the next 10 years, the impact of all of those companies transitioning can really add up to some serious numbers in terms of employment and sales. And so to get a feel for what that may look like in your community is a really important first step. Again, all the OWN members, and especially, and us at the OEOC are happy to help you work through that and to kind of figure that out. So that's it for me. I'll leave this open for questions, but I didn't want to talk all the way to the end. So thanks again. Appreciate it.
Anyone have any other questions they want to put in the chat box?
So while we're waiting for people to maybe ask a few more questions, I want to say that all of this, maybe we'll put it in the email to follow up, but this is all pulled from a report that we put out in early September. And so we're happy to provide it. And that report's on a webpage that also has a really cool, useful map that provides you the number of businesses that are owned by baby boomers in all counties of Ohio. And if you hover over it, it'll give you those numbers, as well as which Ohio Worker Ownership Network nonprofit is in your given region with the contact information. So up right now is the contact information for the OEOC. But if you're wondering, well, maybe I'm not in Northeast Ohio, although we do help throughout the state, we're a statewide org. I think that that's a really great resource.
We do have another question. Do you see specific industries more prone to have worker-owned co-ops? Maybe retail?
Yeah, so for worker-owned co-ops, which again is one of the three models of employee ownership, you see a lot of them in the retail or services industry. There's a few reasons for that, but we think one of them is that it's a bit less capital intensive. And so it's a bit easier to have a startup in that case. For the worker-owned co-ops that are in a bit more capital intensive, you tend to not see them started as a startup, but instead formed through a transition type process where a selling owner may have had a more entrepreneurial model, is looking to exit, then sells to employees. For ESOPs, generally, there's a lot more in manufacturing and construction, but they're also very common in professional service industries as well. And I would say for both types, you have representation from every industry.
How many worker co-ops and ESOPs are there in the US?
Yeah, so for ESOPs, the count is it's very good and reliable because as an ESOP being a qualified retirement plan, it needs to file with both the IRS and the Department of Labor. And so we're able to get a really good read on that number. And there's around 6,500 ESOPs in the US right now, employing 14 million, what we call participants in the ESOP plans. And for worker cooperatives, there is not any governmental body that they need to register with at the federal level, at least. And so a lot of this data is collected by the US Federation of Worker Co-ops. And to their last, what they call census of the sector, there's around 450 to 500 worker co-ops employing around 7,000 worker members. So together, around 7,000 employee-owned companies total in the US.